This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Robin Bernstein, a cultural historian who specializes in race and racism from the 19th century to the present. She teaches at Harvard, where she is the Dillon Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies and Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. She wrote Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit, with fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Dr. Bernstein's previous book, Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights, won 5 awards. She has also written a Jewish feminist children's book, many prize-winning articles and op-eds and essays in the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and other venues. She recently received the Everett Mendelsohn Excellence in Mentoring Award. Hello, Dr. Bernstein. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we will dive in. I know it is the summer, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But how did you get into Black studies as a field?
Well, I've listened to a number of your podcasts. This is a wonderful podcast show. Thank you so much for having me. And I've heard a lot of other people say on your show that it was inevitable. This is what they were put on the planet to do. And then I've heard some other people on your show say that they kind of stumbled into it. And I'm more toward the latter than the former. So there are two parts to my story. One is the academic part, and then one is really the part that starts really when I was a kid with my family. So I'll tell you the academic part first. I never defined myself as a scholar in Black studies. I never defined myself as an African Americanist. I'm a white person, and I do not have a degree in African American studies. My PhD is in American studies. I always defined myself as a scholar of critical race studies, a scholar of racial formation, and specifically, I define myself as a scholar of white supremacy. I'm really interested in the lie of white supremacy. One of the core questions that propels me is, how can a huge number of people become convinced that something that is patently false is true? And the falseness that I'm interested in is the falseness of white supremacy. I'm interested in what is the cultural machinery that has to exist in order for people to actually put stock in white supremacy. How can white supremacy actually work when it's totally built on a lie? So these are the questions that were propelling me as an academic, and that still propel me. I wrote my dissertation on how ideas about childhood became useful to ideas about white supremacy. Basically, how ideas about childhood innocence became weaponized as tools of white supremacy. And that resulted in my first book, Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights. And that came out in 2011. And so I wrote this book, and it was all about white supremacy. And people started addressing me as somebody who was in Black studies. And I thought, oh, wow, I did not expect that. I was deeply honored and very touched to find out that my work was useful in those conversations. But it was not something that I ever set out to do. And then I got recruited to be in a department of African and African American studies. And I, was so honored to join that department. And it is still one of the great joys in my life that I can contribute to that academic endeavor. But there's also a longer story, which goes back to my own childhood. And so I was born in 1969, and when I was a young kid, Roots came on TV, the TV show Roots. Now, I'm this, Jewish kid in Brooklyn with white Jewish liberal parents, and we were the kind of family where the kids weren't allowed to watch a lot of TV. And then Roots comes on, and I'm in second grade, and my parents not only were going to allow us to watch this epic show with many hours over a full week, but they wanted us to watch it, my brother and me both. And they gave us a really good reason for why they wanted us to watch it and why it was so important for us to watch this show. And the reason was that what they explained to me was this is American history. And we were very clear that this was not our racial history, and it was not our ethnic history, and it was not our family's history, but we were Americans. And this was American history. And my parents wanted me and my brother both to watch it as Americans. And it made a huge impression on me. What I really took away from that, from my parents, was slavery, the Civil War, emancipation, abolition. This is the history of every American, and that includes me. All of the oppression, the racism involved in it, the resistance, all of it is American history. And this is what I still believe today. So I got really interested. I was very powerfully moved by Roots as a young child, and then I kept reading about specifically 19th century African American history, and it really started me on a path of just learning everything I could for decades, and I'm still on that trajectory.
Thank you. That's it's interesting how Roots shifted or caused so many people to be interested that it's come up in a couple other of the interviews that I've done, right? Watching that really set people on a path to like, I need to
Yeah,
know more. Um,
yeah,
in a way that really speaks to the importance of multiple types of genres of the
yeah.
way that stories are told, right? Because
Mm.
you wouldn't have necessarily picked up an academic book when you're a child,
Not in second grade, definitely not.
but it sparked something that so I first of all, I've never heard somebody say that they are a scholar of white supremacy. I think that that is very interesting in terms of that framing. Um, do you wanna say a little bit more about the elements of that cultural machinery that you talk about, um, as allowing the lie of white supremacy to continue?
Sure. So it's a very big and very elaborate lie. And whenever you're trying to convince a huge number of people that something that's just patently false is true, there has to be enormous energy going into that project. Um, when I wrote my dissertation, I imagined it as a machine that could convince everybody that up was down and down was up. And I thought, okay, if you were going to have some sort of a machine that could be very large and enclose a lot of people inside it and somehow make them feel the reversal of gravity. I thought, okay, how big would that machine have to be? How much energy would it have to consume? How would it have to be maintained? What would happen in the inevitable moments when the machine failed and everybody fell and realized that up was in fact up and down was in fact down? So this was the metaphor that I worked with when I was writing my dissertation. I'm interested in the cultural machinery. So I'm a cultural historian. I'm always interested in how we come to believe what we believe. And, here I was answering your first question. And what do? I tell you about a television show because television matters.
Mhm,
And on the one hand, I could be embarrassed because, oh my goodness, my life was affected by a TV show. Well, yes, my life was affected by a TV show. All of our lives are
mhm,
affected by culture. I believe that culture is really important because it helps us understand what we understand. It helps us know what we know. It frames everything, and it provides a set of metaphors that we use to understand everything around us. We can't think without stories. We're human animals. We think with stories. So all of this is to say, this is why this is the particular approach I take to white supremacy. I think the reason I study white supremacy is because it makes me really angry. And a lot of scholars are able to write about things they love. They're able to write from a place of love and admiration and support. And I think that's wonderful. And frankly, I'm a little jealous. I write from a place of anger. Most of my scholarship, I write about things that make me angry. And white supremacy makes me very angry. So I write about white supremacy a lot. And the main tools I have to understand it and to write about it are cultural history and, in particular, performance studies. So I'm trained as a performance scholar, and I'm particularly interested in the ways that performances, including television performances, affect what we think and what we see and how we understand ourselves.
Thank you. That that actually leads really well into the next question, which then I want to use to talk about your most recent book. But so you said that you don't necessarily consider yourself to be a Black Studies scholar in like the trained sense, but you do cultural history and you have a background in performance study and you very much study um, white supremacy. So, how do you situate yourself in relationship to disciplines, given that you are in a Black Studies department now, one of the most well known Black Studies departments?
This is true. So, I'm trained as an interdisciplinary scholar. I actually don't have any degree in any discipline. So, American Studies as a field, it integrates a lot of different disciplines. But for me, the main disciplines that I integrate are archive-based history and textual analysis and performance analysis. So those are my 3 tools that I bring to the table. Um, Other people started calling me an African Americanist. And one thing that we learn in performance studies is that our identities are created in part by what we're willing to answer to. And this is something that Althusser suggested, that people call you something, and the question is, do you respond? Do you say, "Oh yes, that's me. I'm willing to be that"? So people say woman, and you have to decide, am I willing to say yes? Okay, I'll answer to that. I'm a woman. And in my case, people started calling me an African Americanist. And I said I would be honored to answer to that call. And I have worked very hard to try to be worthy of it, and to wear it with humility and gratitude, and say, as long as people want to call me that, I'm willing to answer to that name and be very grateful for it.
Thank you. So you mentioned the archival histories, right? Which I'm sure had to come into play in this latest book. So do you want to speak a little bit about the Freeman's Challenge book? And because in looking at it, right, it really is shifting how we think about the for prison profit system, or at least the start of the for prison profit system, and what the implications of that re a new understanding of where it started, I think is really important and has a lot of there's a lot that can be said about it just in general. So
Yeah.
we could start with you just talking about your book.
Sure. I'd love to. Thank you so much. So, my book is called Freeman's Challenge: The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. And it is about how profit driven incarceration began in the North, not the South, long before the Civil War, long before the 13th Amendment. So, what a lot of the story that we have received is that profit-driven incarceration began in the South after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment, that it was a way to reincarcerate African Americans who had been freed with emancipation, and that it was slavery by another name. Now, the story that I just recited has a lot that's right about it, but it has some key things that are wrong. What's right about it is that profit-driven incarceration, convict leasing, things like that, absolutely is slavery by another name. And it absolutely is a reanimation of slavery after emancipation. However, slavery ended in the North in the United States long before it ended in the South. About, depending on what state you're talking about, it ended around half a century before. In New York State specifically, it ended half a century before the Civil War. And as a result, profit-driven incarceration began 50 years it began in the North 50 years before it began in the South. Convict leasing, this suite of practices of re-enslavement, they are Northern inventions, not Southern inventions. So I set out to tell the story of profit-driven incarceration, putting the North back in the story. When we start the story with the South and the 13th Amendment and the Civil War, the problem with that is that when we do that, we inadvertently let the North off the hook. What I wanted to do in Freeman's challenge was put the North back on the hook. So I wanted to tell this story of profit-driven incarceration in the North long before the Civil War. I wanted to tell it in a vivid way that nobody would ever forget it. And so I chose to tell it through one person, and his name was William Freeman. William Freeman was an African American and also Native American teenager. He was 15 years old, and he grew up in the town of Auburn, New York. Auburn was a tiny little village in central New York State, but it happened to be the birthplace of prison for profit. The very first profit-driven prison was in Auburn, New York, where William Freeman just happened to be born. And he had a pretty good life until he was 15 years old. He was accused of stealing a horse. There was no hard evidence against him, but it didn't matter. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in America's original prison for profit, the Auburn State Prison. And William Freeman, what makes him so important to the history of prisons in the United States is that William Freeman challenged the system. Here he is, he's a kid, he's a teenager, and he is in this system that is designed to enslave people. And the prisoners were actually called, quote, slaves of the state. Literally, they were called that in New York State. And he rebelled. He pushed back. He resisted the system, and he challenged it, and he challenged it in a way that had huge implications. So this is the story that I tell, and I wanted to tell it in a way that was really engaging and that people would want to read. It's a very serious book because it is, well, first of all, it has a very serious topic, but also I did massive research. Every single word in the book is true. I didn't make up one single thing. But I wrote the book in a style that I wanted it to feel like a novel. I wanted people to keep turning the pages because I cared about William Freeman so much, and I cared about the history of prison for profit so much. I wanted people to read this book. So that is how I wrote this book.
Well, thank you for that. I think that so I have several questions, but I do think that one, the style, um, it being much more like a novel is super engaging, and it's important to get people to keep reading it, right? Especially when we're talking about very heavy topics. It can be hard to stay in and engaged in work that is so heavy, but making it a novel propels you forward in a way that I think is going to help to spread Freeman's story
Yeah.
and allow people to understand that, like, as you said, like, not let the North off the hook.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and this is where, going back to your question earlier about how do I position myself in relation to Black studies, you know, in my earlier work, I was writing mostly about white people because I was writing about white supremacy. And I certainly was writing about Black people as they responded to white supremacy, as they lived within a white supremacist system. But this was my first book where I really was writing a lot about a Black person. Now, it's still a book about white supremacy. The second half of the book is about William Freeman. I should back up just for a moment. Um, Part of William Freeman's resistance to the Auburn State Prison involved a murder. And I'm not giving away anything when I say that. It's right there in the title of the book, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. So it's right out there, from page one. Um, but he does commit a murder and he goes on trial. And the second half of the book is about the trial and the effects of the trial. And basically, the argument that I make is that some of the most virulent forms of anti Black racism that we're all so familiar with today actually incubated in William Freeman's trial, which was a very big deal. His trial was publicized throughout the United States. The transcripts from the trial were published daily. The trial generated, by one estimate, about 1 million words of print. So it was called the trial of the half century. So this was a hugely influential trial. And what I show, and this was 1846, what I show in the book is that this was one of the birthplaces of two anti-Black racist ideas. One was the idea of criminalization, basically the racist idea that Black people are somehow more prone toward criminal behavior. And the other one is what became known in the Moynihan Report, more than a century later, as the pathology argument that Black culture is somehow pathological. There's somehow something wrong with it. And what we see is both of those ideas getting articulated in 1846 in William Freeman's trial, and then not just being articulated, but then being amplified nationwide. So this actually really resets some of our ideas about periodization, because both of these ideas are generally, by most scholars, considered to have flourished and effloresced and metastasized in the final quarter of the 19th century. So, but here we are, quite a bit earlier, antebellum as opposed to postbellum. So this is some of the importance of William Freeman's story. It's a story that is that starts with the prison and starts with the history of the prison, and it ends with anti-Black racism. So this is the narrative arc. But this was the first time that I was really writing in a very, very deep way about historical Black individuals, and I had to be very thoughtful as I did that. I was always very conscious that I did not have access to the interiority of these historical individuals, that I was writing about what I could know, what I did have access to. I didn't know what they thought. I didn't know how they felt. I didn't want to impose my own ideas about that. But what I did know was what they did. I knew what they said. I knew what they experienced. I knew I knew all about the things that happened to them and what their experience was like. And I knew what William Freeman's experience was like. So I spent a lot of time thinking, okay, at this moment in his life, what could he see? At this particular moment when he was standing in this place at this time, what could he smell? What could he see? What could he hear or not hear? Because he was beaten so badly when he was in the Auburn State Prison that he actually became largely deaf. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what could he hear and what could he not hear, and what would it be like to be able to hear these things or not hear these things. So this was a little bit about how I thought about the process of writing as I was writing it.
So I actually want to follow up on that specifically. The So a lot of times, right, when working with archival sources, there aren't a lot of archival sources that are from the perspective of Black people, right? Because they weren't allowed to produce, or it wasn't maintained, or oral history was not considered to be valid, all of the reasons, right? So, what is that process like to try to imagine these things from the perspective of someone whose voice is not going to have the same type of representation in the archive of the news reporters or the judge or even the jailer?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I had to work really hard on that. So, as I mentioned, he had this huge trial, and quite a few members of his family testified in the trial. So William Freeman never testified, but his mother did. His brother-in-law did. His sister-in-law did. And they all spoke about Freeman, and they spoke about, first of all, their love for him, how much they loved him, and they also spoke about what he had said to them. And so that and there are transcripts of those trials, and the transcripts were in fact published. So, and I also was able to find some unpublished handwritten transcripts in an archive, and that was really amazing. And they largely matched the published transcripts, but not exactly. So so I do have those testimonies, and that to me is really important. Now, we have to look at them aslant because when his mother was testifying on his behalf, was she saying what she honestly believed? Was she saying what she thought would save his life, or both?
Mhm.
And there's no way to know what she was thinking, but we do know what she said. And I decided that I was going to take sworn testimony really seriously. And because whatever people were thinking as they testified, they took enormous personal risks
Mhm.
to testify on behalf of their loved one. It took a great deal of courage to walk into this courtroom and speak up on behalf of a Black man who had committed a murder. So these people were very, very brave. And I took them extremely seriously, all the while knowing that that didn't necessarily mean that they were simply saying what they believed. I'm very sure they were being strategic, as anybody walking into a courtroom would be. So that is one way that I approached William Freeman's voice. Well, even though I don't have he never wrote, he did not write his own story, he did not dictate a confession like Nat Turner, for example, but he was extensively quoted in the transcripts, both by people who were testifying for him, like his mother, and by people who were testifying against him. And so one thing I tried to do is read across the sources, and I figured if you have a whole bunch of people, if you have 5 or 6 different people who have different agendas, all saying William Freeman said X, well, he probably did.
Mhm.
That's how I looked at it, and of course, the transcripts of the trial were not the only source at all, because this was such a big deal. People were talking to reporters, people were writing about it in their journals. I have, access to this 5,000-word journal that was kept by, a minister who was in town, and so, I was able to read the parts of the journal. He was very involved in the trial. He was present, almost every day during the trial, and he wrote about it extensively in his diary. So that was a really, really important source for me. So all of these different sources that enabled me to when I read across them, I didn't trust any one source to be just transparent. But when I read across them, I was able to really home in on William Freeman's voice and what William Freeman was saying. And in a nutshell, what William Freeman was saying was that the Auburn State Prison had stolen his labor. And what he wanted was back pay. He wanted to be paid for his work because he was not paid anything at all while he was incarcerated for his labor. He was working 12 hours a day and getting literally nothing. And that's what he wanted. He wanted to be paid for his work.
Thank you. I one of the things that has repeatedly come up in different conversations I've been fortunate enough to have with everyone on the podcast has really been about is really thinking about the methods, right? The methods that have to be integrated in order to do this work, because most of the methodologies that especially traditional fields and disciplines rely on do not necessarily take into consideration um, the very intentional blocking out of certain voices. And of course, like women, genders, and sexuality studies addresses this, Black studies addresses this, Native studies, like those fields definitely work to do that. But taking these methodologies that most people are trained in disciplinarily, um, and then reading against or across
Mhm.
or within the through lines of them, I think is such an important reminder for how intentional you have to be with this work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think on the one hand, we have to be very suspicious of archives. And this is something that Sadia Hartman has taught us all,
Mhm.
which is that archives are structured. I mean, they are structured according to white supremacist logics. And what Hartman pointed out very correctly is that in the 19th century, especially when Black people entered the archive, most of the time when Black lives became recorded in archives, most of the time it was under conditions of violence, under conditions of white supremacist violence. So either the bookkeeping of slavery, or in the case of Freeman's Challenge, the criminal justice system. So basically, when Black people got either commodified or um, or caught up in legal systems, victimized through legal systems, that's when their voices entered the archive. So we have to be enormously suspicious of this. On the other hand, there is still so much that can be done either with these very tainted, very problematic sources, or there are other sources that are in the archives. And I thought a lot as I wrote this book about a friend of mine and a very cherished, very respected colleague, Heather Andrea Williams, who has written several absolutely amazing books about enslaved and formerly enslaved people. And she was once talking with me about how she was in this archive and she was saying to herself, where are the Black people? Where are the Black people? And she just kept asking herself, where are the Black people? I'm going to find them in this white archive. And just by in demanding that the archive show her past Black lives, and by being absolutely convinced that Black lives were in the archive, she had to find them. There were no excuses. She had to find them. She did, and she found absolutely amazing things. And I took a lot of inspiration from that as I was writing Freeman's Challenge. There was one moment I remember really vividly where I had a moment of sadness, and I have all these personal testimonies from so many white people who, wrote their memoir or, dictated this and wrote that. And I have so much autobiography from the white people in the book. And I had this moment of sadness where I thought, oh, I wish somebody in William Freeman's family had written a memoir. I wish they had, I wish that existed. And then I thought, no, they did write. They wrote. It's my job to find how they wrote. And I thought, okay, if they did not write with on paper, with words on paper, they wrote in some other way, and it's my job to find their writing, no excuses. And I thought and I thought, and I realized their name. The Freeman family named themselves. They had been enslaved by a family named Hardenberg. And when they became free, they could have named themselves Hardenberg. Lots of people just named themselves after their former enslavers. They could have named themselves anything they wanted, but they didn't. They chose to name themselves Freeman. And the family became free through gradual emancipation, so they didn't become free all at once. The family became free very slowly over a period of about a quarter century. And as each member of the family became free, they named themselves Freeman. And I said to myself, that is it. That is writing. That is a form of inscription. That is a family autobiography in one word. That is what this family believed in. That is what this family cared about. That is how this family saw themselves in the present and also in the future. They were writing their future into their name. So we can find these sources, and they do tell us something, and they do matter.
That, again, is a wonderful reminder. Like, it is the job of the scholar to find where the voices are, because they're there.
Mm-hmm.
Have to find them, and they're not necessarily going to be obvious. Or,
Mm-hmm.
as you said, we're not going to find memoirs. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and even in those instances where we do have memoirs and we have the narratives, right? Those are also produced at a particular moment with particular cosigns for particular purposes. So
Mm-hmm.
seeing what, doing the excavation that is necessary and the deep thought that is necessary to see and find the voices in an archive that was not designed to represent them. Um, I think it's so important when we're thinking about Black studies and Black history in general, and American history, because as you said with Roots, like, this is all American history. It's not just the history of one people, because it's the history that goes back to the cultural machinery of this country. Which
That's right.
the other question I wanted to ask, so in thinking about not letting the North off the hook, right? And that so often happens when we think about anything that happened in the history with regards to white supremacy and discrimination and all of that. Like, the North does get let off the hook. I guess so, and I don't know, this might not be a question that can even be answered, but what do you think is the purpose, right, of us always, of society crafting a narrative that so often lets the North off the hook for the initiation in sometimes, but also perpetuation of that machinery that keeps white supremacy going?
I love that question. That is such a great question. I think that one of the purposes of this cultural machinery that very consistently lets the North off the hook, lets us forget that slavery existed in the North, segregation existed and continues to exist in
Mhm.
the North. Racism is not a pure invention of the South. The North has its own versions of racism. Um, so what is it for? What is the purpose of letting the North off the hook? And obviously, the North itself has a lot to gain by absolving itself of 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 um, of of um, of responsibility. One thread that connects my first book to my second book. So my first book was Racial Innocence, and it was about the way that the idea of childhood innocence became a tool of white supremacy. It's basically about how the idea of childhood innocence, which sounds non-racial, it sounds racially neutral, but in fact, it was always racially fraught. And it was always, from the very beginning of its existence, it was a tool of white supremacy. And then it was a tool with which Black people fought and continue to fight white supremacy. So innocence was a key idea in my first book, and innocence is a key idea in my second book. Not only William Freeman's innocence, because he always insisted that he had not committed the horse theft that he was convicted of, but also a huge factor in Freeman's challenge is the way that white people in Auburn and in New York State and more broadly were insisting on seeing themselves as innocent. They did not want to hear what William Freeman was saying, which was that the Auburn State Prison, which was creating profit-driven incarceration, that prison was claiming to be a tool of justice, but really, it was a tool of organized labor theft. It was stealing labor, and all the while saying that this was justice. It was enslaving people in a state that by that time was claiming not to have slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So what Freeman was challenging was the innocence of this system. And white people fought back really hard against Freeman's challenge because he was not only threatening their economic security, because this prison was changing the economy of all of New York State. It was in some ways running. It was a huge influence on the entire economy of New York State. So he was challenging the economy of New York State. And remember, he's a teenager. But what he was also challenging was the identity of white people in Auburn and in New York State who, these white people who believed that the prison was good and that the profits that they were making off of this prison, there was nothing wrong with that. He was challenging their self-concept as innocent. So when you ask me, what's fueling this persistent need for the North to seem to get off the hook, I would say what's at stake is innocence. What's at stake is this claim to innocence. And what I see in American history is a very persistent action of the North pointing to the South and saying all of these negative things about the South, many of which, by the way, are often true. Let me be very clear that I'm not in no way saying that the South is not racist, but pointing to the South and saying, it's only you. It's not me. I am innocent. You are guilty. And I'm interested in interrupting that.
Thank you. The idea of innocence, I think that's so, there's so much that could be said about that, particularly right now. And um, a weaponized innocence
Mhm.
that perpetuates over time and space and geographic area and all of that. Um, but I do want to ask you how your work and these ideas, how does this play out in your classrooms? How does it influence the way that you interact with students?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So there's no simple answer to that. I mean, I can't say here are the three ways. It's more amorphous than that. The issue of innocence is really fraught. There are a lot of people who are very invested in the idea that children really are innocent. And if you just simply try to historicize that, if I simply say something like, well, actually, the idea that children are innocent is a historically specific idea. 1,000 years ago, nobody believed that. There's nothing eternal about that belief. And in fact, the idea that children are innocent, it began about in the late 18th, early 19th century. And the US was one of the places that innovated that idea. And when that idea came about in the US in the late 18th, early 19th century, it was very swiftly racialized. Even though it sounds racially neutral, it was not from the very beginning. Well, if you say that to people, very often some people will take immediate offense and want to argue, but children really are innocent. And for me as a historian, that's really hard because I know that we are in a moment where, in a moment meaning 200 years, where that is a very, very deep belief. And it's hard for us to imagine not believing that. And it can even feel threatening to imagine not believing that. But the fact is, we've believed that for a couple hundred years, but we as a species are many thousands of years old. And this is a historically specific idea. So, so sometimes when I share these ideas with students, I'm very careful because they're controversial ideas, and they are ideas that challenge people in a pretty fundamental way. The work on prisons, I have to say, students have been very receptive to. I've had students who are from central New York State, and they know the Auburn State Prison. I should say that the Auburn State Prison is still in existence and it's still in operation. Today, the Auburn Prison is the oldest continually operating maximum security prison in the United States, and it is still a site of manufacturing. So William Freeman was forced to manufacture consumer goods. Today, 100% of all license plates that are built in New York State are built in this particular prison, the Auburn prison, no other prison in New York State. So anybody listening, if you've ever seen a New York State license plate or owned a car with New York State license plates, those individual plates were printed by men, and they are all men, who were literally walking in William Freeman's footsteps. So this is, a very contemporary history. We can literally touch it. If you can touch a New York State license plate, you have touched William Freeman's history. So students understand that. They really get it. And students have also responded very well to this idea that we can't keep letting the North off the hook. That is something that my students have really taken to and been very, very receptive to.
Thank you. Yeah. I do think that um there has been a lot of conversation in recent years around prisons and what that means in terms of us as a society and the criminal justice system in a way that might not have been as out there um, as in the past. Um, but I could see, or I can see how this idea of innocence and children being innocent, not necessarily like that's not a universal truth. That is a belief that you can pinpoint to a specific time that it started being, as are so many things that we believe that are just a thing. Right? Even if we talk about race, like when I'm trying to explain to students that like race is not a biological thing, that's not something that they've necessarily come across before coming to college. So it's like, but it is, but it's not. Like it's a social construct that
Mhm,
has real
mhm,
world implications, but like
mhm,
it's not a biological thing. Um, so confronting those assumed truths
mhm.
and firmly held beliefs can definitely be difficult. So
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, absolutely, and one of the most important ideas that I try to foreground when I teach is that constructed doesn't mean fake. Just because something is constructed doesn't mean that it's fake. Actually, something is constructed, that's how it becomes real. So I like to say, this building that we're in right now, this building was constructed. It's completely real. It's real because it was constructed. And it's the same thing with race. Race is constructed. Race is completely real. It's real because it was constructed. Race is just as real as the building that we are in right now. It's real because humans made it real. If humans had never made this building, it wouldn't exist. If humans had never made race, it wouldn't exist. But they did make it, so it does exist.
Yes. Okay. So, 2 questions left.
Okay.
The first, um, is what interests you most about the past of Black studies?
Mm. I think what interests me most about the past of Black studies is how much brilliance there is. Um, I never stop reading Black voices from the past. I love reading intellectual work from the 19th century. And there is so much brilliance, so much insight. And, we can think of like the big geniuses that we can all name. I mean, we can think about Frederick Douglass and we can think about Anna Julia Cooper and, all of these people who, like, we know they're geniuses. We already know that.
Mhm.
But when I read these very obscure people, I'm continually amazed by how much brilliance there is. So, uh, one of the rabbit holes I went down when I was writing Freeman's Challenge, there was this very, very interesting person who was pretty peripheral to the story. So I didn't write a whole lot about him, but he was this African American guy who lived in Auburn, and he knew William Freeman, and he was a very minor part of the trial. And he was one of the people in Auburn who worked with other Black people to create Black schools and to support the AME Zion Church. So he was a local activist and a community-minded person. Well, I found out that 30 years after the trial, he published a book. And it's a book that, as far as I'm aware, there is no scholarship on this book at all. But it's basically a book of this guy's racial thought, his racial theorizing, and it's online. It is online, and anybody can read it for free. And so I put a footnote in there because, I wasn't going to write a whole lot about him or his book because, he published this book long after the events in my book. It wasn't directly relevant, but I wanted other people to be able to find this book and, somebody's gotta write about this. So anyway, it's in a footnote. You can read it in Freeman's Challenge. So going back to your question, for me, like, Black studies doesn't only involve academics in the 20th and 21st centuries. When I think about Black studies, I'm thinking about people like Du Bois. I'm thinking about people like Anna Julia Cooper, and I'm thinking about people like this person that nobody's ever heard of who published this one book. So, what's most important to me, what's most exciting to me, the length of Black studies, how old it is, how and how much brilliance there is and how much dedication there is over such a long and sustained period of time, the depth of the intellectual tradition of studying Black lives and theorizing Black lives and honoring Black lives, it blows me away.
So, now on the flip side, right? What excites you most about the present and future? Or even what do you think are really important questions or ideas to be engaged in this moment and as we move forward?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think a lot of really exciting things are happening in Black studies right now. I mean, one thing is that, there's a real trend in, family history, and that's super cool. So a lot of people are really looking to their own family histories, and what they're doing that's exciting to me is, how they're, you know, honoring their families per se, but they're also placing their family histories in a much larger context so that it matters to a much broader audience. So, people like Kendra Field and Martha Jones, and there are just so many people who are writing family histories in ways that are really beautiful and exciting. So that's clearly something that's really important. Another thing that's really important is, I mean, this is not so much a subject trend or but one thing that's really exciting is how much is now digitized that was never digitized before. So, like I mentioned this book that nobody has heard of, that probably there are probably 3 or 4 copies of it in obscure libraries around the world total. But you don't have to travel to a library. You can go online and read it for free anytime you want. And